Thank you first off for putting this together and having these talks and these events in this kind of time with the social distancing and whatnot. But today I'll be talking to all of you about my work on coverage and inspection planning for unmanned aerial vehicles. So the main goal of my research is to understand the current methods used for UAVs to conduct coverage planning and to improve on the state of the art. I work within the Ross Lab under the advisement of Dr. Pratap Tokekar. Yes. UAVs are starting to become more common in many different applications. In the top left video, we can see a UAV executing infrastructure inspection on a bridge. In this application, the UAV could provide different viewpoints of the bridge and help inspectors fully cover the bridge. Another application would be precision agriculture. In precision agriculture, farmers may have to monitor many acres of crops. However, many of these acres of crops are so densely packed that the farmer would not be able to walk to them. In this application, farmers could leverage the UAVs to get aerial shots of the crops and obtain data they previously couldn't. In that bottom left video, we can see a UAV with a thermal camera being used in a firefighter application. In this application, a unique perspective that a UAV gives to the firefighters could provide a safer experience and allow firefighters to gain more information on the fire in progress. And lastly, in the bottom right video, we can see the company Wing, which is actually really close to my university, Virginia Tech. And so Wing is actually executing package delivery. So with COVID-19 happening right now and the social distancing practices, we can really see how having this system in this company would really help with those social distancing practices. So in all of these applications, a UAV provides a new perspective to gather more data and reduce the time, cost, and risk in many of these applications. So let us consider the application of precision agriculture. The goal of precision agriculture is to do agriculture in a data-driven fashion. By supplementing the manual data collection with UAVs, we can get detailed information on the crops and determine whether or not we would need to provide more water or nutrition in certain areas. While we can manually pilot the UAV to really scale this, what we need are efficient path planning algorithms designed to cover these farms and gather data. Another application that I focus on is infrastructure and inspection. By introducing UAVs, we can provide a safer alternative to infrastructure inspection by removing the inspectors from hazardous situations, like this one. Again, what we need are efficient path planning algorithms that can plan coverage paths for the UAV in complex and potentially unknown environments. So the beginning of my work, I first focus on the point coverage problem. For this problem, I impose a few restrictions. I first need the UAV to conduct persistent missions. The UAV would have a battery capacity limitation, and a point is covered by the UAV if it's flown from above. And finally, I look for a tour that visits all the points, and that's executed by that UAV. So with that, if a UAV needs to conduct persistent missions and it has a limited battery life, how does that exactly work? Well, here I implement a UGV to act as a mobile charging station. So here we can imagine a UAV autonomously landing on that UGV, recharging or battery swapping, and then taking off again so it can execute longer persistent missions. So with that, I will now explain the single mobile charging station problem. And I call that SMCS for short, and I might use that later on in this presentation. To first start off, the inputs of this problem would be a set of vertices, which is a set of n sites, as well as two parameters, which would be the charging and discharging parameters of the battery. Now at output, we will want a UAV tour that visits all the sites given, as well as a UGV tour that visits a subset of these sites. And this UGV tour will be there to assist the UAV when recharging is needed. Lastly, we want the minimum number of UGVs if the UGV is slower, and a charging schedule for where, when, how, and how much to recharge the UAV. So with that, from the SMCS problem, here are a list of assumptions. First off, the UAV can use the UGV multiple times to recharge. The UAV has that limited battery life. The UAV and UGV start at the same depot site. All sites are visited at the same altitude. UAVs can fly in between any two sites if at 100% battery life, and the UGV has unlimited fuel/battery capacity compared to UAV. Now with that, I'll introduce to you three problem variants prior to explaining how I solved the SMCS problem. And here are the three problem variants that my algorithm actually is able to solve. So the first one is having a single UGV acting as a mobile charging platform, which is the SMCS problem I'll use from now on. The second one is placement of multiple stationary charging stations. And the third one is having a UGV acting as a slower mobile charging platform. And for this problem, we actually look to minimize the number of UGVs necessary to service a UAV so that it can execute persistent missions. So before we understand how to solve the SMCS problem, we need to understand what the traveling salesperson problem is. For the traveling salesperson problem, we take as input a graph, and the objective is to find a minimum cost tour that visits every single one of the vertex in the graph exactly once. Now the cost of this tour will just be the sum of the edge costs. In general, TSP is an NP-hard problem, and with this, it is impossible to have an algorithm that always finds the optimal solution in polynomial time. However, we show that there are some good practical solvers. And in the figures we can see in the bottom left figure, we could have an input of 5 sites, and then in the middle figure, we would have an output non-optimal tour, and then on the bottom right figure, we actually would have an output optimal tour that TSP could give us. So with the understanding of the traveling salesperson problem, we now need to understand what the generalized traveling salesperson problem is, or GTSP. So GTSP is very similar, where we take as input a graph. However, these vertices are also clustered. So the objective of the GTSP is to find a minimum cost tour that visits every single cluster exactly once, not every single vertex. And again, the cost of the tour is exactly the same, where the sum of the cost edges on the tour. In general, GTSP is also NP-hard because it is a special case of TSP. Or TSP is a special case of GTSP actually. So TSP would have every single cluster containing exactly one vertex. So now that we understand what GTSP is, we look at formulating our SMCS formulation as a GTSP instance. And to do that, we have to ask ourselves 3 questions. These 3 questions are, what are the clusters, the nodes, and the edges for our GTSP instance? Now, each cluster in the GTSP instance would be an original site in the SMCS problem. So here we would have 5 original sites, A, B, C, D, and E, and we would have output for our GTSP instance, 5 clusters, A, B, C, D, and E. Now the nodes within these clusters would actually specify the different battery levels the UAV could be at. So in this case, I gave it 6 different battery levels, 1 through 6, and we would duplicate that for every single cluster, or every single original site. And then lastly, we need to understand how the edges are created. For the edges, there are 3 different types of edges we take the minimum of. These 3 types of edges are shown here, where we have the first type of edge, where UAVs flying from site I to site J, and in that case, we would only have the UAV's battery life going down. And we can see in the figure that those blue lines represent downward progression of battery life. The type 2 edge, we have the UAV landing on the UGV carrying the UAV to the next takeoff site, and then taking off at site J. In this case, while the UGV is carrying that UAV, it could potentially be recharging it if there's a recharging platform. And here, this is why we can see the red edges only go up in battery life, because the UAV is not actually using any of its energy to move from site I to site J. And then lastly, for type 3, we'll have a UAV and UGV meeting up at site J. In this case, we have a flight from I to J of the UAV, and then the UAV would actually land on the UGV that's waiting for it. It would recharge in place and then take off again. So here are the 3 types of edges we need for our GTSP instance. With that, our GTSP instance, we are able to use a GTSP solver. And for us, we use the solver GLNS, which is now one of the state-of-the-arts. With GLNS, we're able to obtain a GTSP solution, and from that we have to convert it back to our SMCS problem. So to do that, we ask ourselves two questions. How do we get the UAV path, and how do we get the UGV path? So to get the UAV path, it's relatively simple, where we actually look at the order in which we visit the clusters that the GTSP solution gave us. So the order in which we visit those clusters will actually be the order in which we need to visit the original sites. And so how do we get the UGV path? To do that, we actually have to look at the types of edges that were used. If you remember, edge type 1 is just a UAV flying. So in that case, neither the beginning or the end node of that edge would be added to the UGV path. For type 2 edges, we have the UAV landing on the UGV carrying it to the next takeoff site, and then taking off again. For that edge, we'd have both the start and the end node added to the UGV path. And then lastly, for type 3 edges, we have the UAV and UGV meeting up at the end node. So we would only add the end site to the UGV path. So now we have both our UAV path and our UGV path. So for our algorithm, we have 5 different input parameters. We have the recharge rate, the takeoff time, landing time, discharge rate, and the UGV speed. We can see in the bottom left figure, or bottom left video, we have the UAV actually being carried by the UGV, and then the UAV taking off. In the bottom right video, we can see the UAV autonomously landing on the UGV. And then in the top right video, we have the UAV autonomously taking off from the UGV. So now I'll introduce to you our system setup. We use a quad rotor that we built within our lab that has 2 GPSs. And using both GPSs, we allow for GPS fusion, which gives us better localization within the environment. We also have an NVIDIA Jetson on board to do online computation. Lastly, for the UAV, we have a LiDAR system which gives us accurate height estimation. Now to execute this autonomous landing, we implement an IR lock system where on the top right figure, you can see the UGV, and there's actually a beacon on top of that UGV, which is an IR beacon. In the bottom left figure, we can see the camera, the IR camera attached to the UAV. And in this case, the image that the IR camera is able to attain of the IR beacon on the UGV allows it to execute minor control inputs to allow for autonomous landing on the UGV. And that's again shown in that bottom right video. So with that, I'll show you one of the full experimental works that I had done. And these are 4 videos, all coming from the exact same video. So in the top left video, we can see the UAV just flying to multiple different sites, and this would be a type 1 edge. In the top right video, we can see the UAV autonomously landing on top of the UGV. In that bottom left video, we can see the UAV being carried by the UGV and then eventually taking off again. And then lastly, in that bottom right video, because our lab doesn't actually own an autonomous recharging station or battery swapping station, we had me do it manually. So this experiment was done over a 34-minute flight time, and it had 50 input sites with 3 landings and takeoffs. So now that we understand the point coverage problem, I wanted to expand my work into the area coverage problem. And this one, yeah. So the area coverage problem, we look to solve these points. We have the UAV needing to cover large areas. We have areas that need to be seen from the air, as well as we want to find a tour to fully cover an area of interest. And here we could use that point coverage algorithm that I had previously explained. However, it wouldn't be scalable. It's because we'd have to create tons and tons of points just to cover a single area. So instead of using the point coverage algorithm, we actually look at conducting coverage of booster feeding cells, which are shown in the bottom right figure. These booster feeding cells are essentially rectangular strips, where the width of each one of these strips is the width or the field of view of the sensor on board the UAV. So I looked at implementing a hybrid UAV system in the lab. A hybrid UAV system allows for vertical takeoff and landing using a multi-rotor mode, and then having long flights in the fixed wing mode. So having both of these capabilities of the hybrid system, we would have a vertical takeoff as well as longer flight times. However, this hybrid UAV would still have limited battery life and battery life limitations. So with that in mind, the area coverage problem is as proposed, or is as shown here. So the inputs would be a set of booster feed-in cells, and again we would have the same charging and discharging parameter. Now for outputs, they're slightly different, where we have a UAV tour which visits all booster feed-in cells instead of just singular sites, and takes into account the Dubin's constraints of the fixed-wing aircraft. We also want a UGV tour which visits a subset of sites located at the ends of the booster feed-in cells. Then lastly, we'd have a charging schedule, a landing schedule, and now we would have a flight mode. So when we should switch between multi-rotor or fixed-wing flight mode of our hybrid UAV. So with this problem formulation, we have a new set of assumptions. Here we have this 5 original assumptions: the recharging battery rate, the takeoff time, the landing time, and the discharge battery rate. We also have that UGVC, and these are the 5 from the point coverage algorithm. However, we have to add 2 new parameters, which would be the fixed wing's turn radius, as well as the ratio of the fixed wing to multi-rotor battery consumption. And this is essentially allowing us to say that the multi-rotor requires more battery consumption while flying than the fixed wing. So here's one of the experiments that was done at Kentland Farms, which is an airspace near Virginia Tech. This experiment took 24 minutes and two landings and takeoffs for 19 booster feed-in cells. In that top left video, we can see the UAV doing area coverage over one of the structures at Kentland Farm. In the bottom left, we can see area coverage of a grassy region. That top figure, we can see the input booster feed-in cells, which is the total of 19. And then in the bottom right video, we can actually see the UAV's flight path and the UGV's path. And both of these were obtained from the UAV's flight controller and UGV's controller afterwards and plotted on Google Maps. So in summary, this algorithm solves the problem of area coverage by utilizing a hybrid UAV system and having a UGV assist to conduct persistent missions. So with both point coverage and area coverage, I looked at expanding my work into the 3D domain, where I looked at studying 3D inspection. For this problem, I wanted to conduct online infrastructure inspection, online UAV path replanning, full coverage of an infrastructure with no prior known map, and finally, I wanted to find a tour to fully inspect an infrastructure using a UAV. So the algorithm that I came up with once again uses a GTSP formulation, and I called it an online GTSP based algorithm for targeted surface bridge inspection, and for short I called it GATSBI. So we can see here the execution of a similar method that can do infrastructure inspection, which is called frontier based 3D exploration. For this method, we would have a UAV use frontiers to explore an environment. And this video was created in Gazebo, and it's the current simulation environment that I use for all of my work. So instead of using this frontier-based exploration, I proposed that GATSBI-based algorithm, or that GATSBI algorithm, which does 3D semantic segmentation of the bridge so that we only cover 3D areas of interest, instead of, like this video shows, the UAV covering areas around the bridge, such as the trees. So with that in mind, the GATSBI problem that I proposed takes as input LiDAR data and RGB images. And with the LiDAR data and the RGB images, we'd be able to do 3D semantic segmentation of the bridge structure from the surrounding environment. We also take as input the replanning trigger time and the distance discrepancy. Now, both of these parameters are parameters that allow the UAV to execute replanning of optimal paths if needed. So lastly, we have as output pass for the UAV to inspect the current visible portion of bridge. Because this is online, the UAV doesn't actually know the full bridge structure. And then lastly, we want a UAV tour to fully inspect a bridge. So now I'll show you our new system that we propose to use for this experiment. That's actually a real-world system instead of just a gazebo world simulation. So for our GATSBI algorithm, we once again have that GTSP formulation. And for this, we cluster viewpoints on the bridge to decrease the cost needed by the UAV to explore or fully inspect that bridge. In the top right figure, we can see the UAV, which we upgraded to a hexcopter, which has a stereo camera, which is the Z, and then a 3D LiDAR, which is the Velodyne VLP-16. And so in that bottom left video, we can actually see this system flying along the side of a bridge structure. And this was done to gather data for both the LiDAR as well as the stereo camera images prior to actually quarantine. And then lastly, in that bottom right video, we can see the UAV flying within the gazebo environment. And this is just showing the 3D occupancy map that's created by the UAV's 3D LiDAR. And this is just a way to represent the known space of being occupied or free space so that the UAV can navigate with within a 3D environment. And so with this, I'd like to thank all of you for coming and listening to my talk. If you have any questions on any of this, please feel free to email me, and I'd be happy to answer any questions now. Thank you.